It started like most Karen stories do, in a peaceful, picture-perfect neighborhood where everything looks normal on the outside. The kind of place with neatly trimmed hedges, cookie-cutter homes, and signs at the entrance that say things like, "Welcome to Harmony Creek," a community built on tradition. But what it really meant was, if you don't follow our unwritten rules, or worse, if you're not one of us, you'll never feel truly welcome here. My wife and I had moved into the suburban maze of perfection about a year ago. We were both Navy. I was recently retired after 22 years of service. My wife, Tessa, had just completed a decade of active duty herself and was transitioning into civilian life. She was sharp, confident, and, like most women who've worn a uniform, she didn't back down from nonsense. We bought the house because it was close to my new job, had a big backyard, and, according to the realtor, it was in one of the safest HOA neighborhoods in the state. What we didn't know was that nestled at the heart of that HOA was a woman named Margaret Dillinger, 62, president of the board, self-appointed enforcer of every shrub trimming and sidewalk chalk violation. She wasn't just an HOA president. She was a dictator with a clipboard. At first, we had no issues. We kept our yard tidy, paid our dues, smiled at the neighbors. Tessa was still adjusting to civilian rhythms. No more early muster calls or saluting officers. But one thing she kept from her service days was her routine of wearing her Navy uniform for official appointments and ceremonies. She was proud of it, and frankly, she looked damn good in it. The first time Margaret saw Tessa in uniform was on a Tuesday morning. Tessa had been invited to speak at a local school for Veterans Appreciation Week. As she walked down the front porch in her crisp Navy service uniform, badges perfectly aligned, her nameplate shining, Margaret happened to be walking her dog. She froze. Now, I didn't witness this personally. I was at work. But later that day, Tessa told me how Margaret just stared at her, not in admiration, not even in curiosity, but with thinly veiled suspicion, like she just spotted someone who didn't belong. Margaret didn't say anything. Not that day. But the next morning, a printed notice was taped to our front door. Not mailed, taped. It was a reminder from the HOA board that residents must refrain from wearing military-style uniforms that could be considered intimidating or confusing to the community. Tessa read it twice, then a third time. She wasn't just annoyed, she was baffled. "This is real," she said, holding it up. There was no signature, no specific reference to her, but we both knew exactly who sent it. She didn't respond. Not right away. Instead, Tessa went about her business, like she always did. She wore her uniform when needed, ceremonies, community service, VA meetings. And every time she stepped outside wearing it, Margaret would find a reason to be nearby. Once it was watering her flower beds at 7 a.m. Another time, walking her dog backwards, just pacing near the sidewalk, watching silently. It wasn't overt, but it was intentional. Then came the Friday that changed everything. Tessa had just returned from speaking at a local memorial event and was still in uniform, standing in the driveway, talking to a neighbor. That's when a police cruiser slowly rolled into the cul-de-sac. At first, we thought it was just a routine patrol, but then it stopped directly in front of our house. 2 officers stepped out, 1 male, 1 female. Calm, polite, but definitely not casual. "Excuse me, ma'am," the male officer said to Tessa. "Are you the homeowner?" She nodded. "Yes, I am. Can I help you?" We received a call from a resident reporting possible impersonation of military personnel. Tessa blinked. "Excuse me?" The caller stated someone in this neighborhood has been dressing in a Navy uniform and maybe misrepresenting themselves as active duty. At this point, I had come out from the garage. Hearing the commotion, Tessa didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply reached into her bag, pulled out her DD 214 and her Navy ID, and handed them over. The officers took one look, then looked at each other. "You're legit," the female officer said. "Retired Navy?" Tessa nodded again. 10 years active duty. Stationed in Norfolk. My husband served 22. The officers apologized immediately. "We're sorry, ma'am. We didn't mean to disrespect you." "No offense taken," she said. but you might want to ask who made the call." They exchanged glances. "We can't disclose that." But the officer trailed off, glancing subtly in the direction of Margaret's house, 2 doors down. Her blinds had shifted. "Oh, I think I know," Tessa said. The officers left shortly after, assuring her there was no issue, but the damage was already done. Because here's the thing about Tessa. She doesn't lose her cool. She doesn't go nuclear over minor slights, but she never forgets a deliberate act of disrespect. And to her, being accused of impersonating a military officer was more than an insult. It was a violation of everything she stood for. Later that night, she sat on the edge of the bed, quiet for a long time. Then she said, "She tried to humiliate me in my own driveway, wearing the uniform I earned. I didn't have to say anything." She added, "Let's see how Margaret feels when I bring the truth to light." And that was just the beginning. After that day with the police cruiser, something shifted in my wife. Tessa wasn't just frustrated. She was focused. You could see it in the way she carried herself, like she was preparing for a mission. But this wasn't deployment or a battlefield. This was something far more personal. She didn't get angry. She didn't complain. Instead, she started documenting. It began quietly. Every time she walked past our front windows, she checked for Margaret. And almost every time, Margaret was there, either in her driveway pruning flowers that didn't exist, or pacing up and down the sidewalk with her phone in hand. Always watching. Always pretending she wasn't. Tessa installed a new security camera on the porch, then another on the garage. She adjusted the one on the back fence to capture more of the street. Within 3 days, our home was covered in silent, all-seeing eyes. Nothing happened without us knowing. Then she bought a small body cam. "Just in case I ever have to talk to her," she said. "I want the full story." The thing is, Tessa never confronted Margaret. She didn't need to, because Karen was about to do all the work for her. It started with anonymous complaints filed with the HOA. Tessa was cited for military paraphernalia visible from the street, referring to a small Navy decal on the back window of her car. A few days later, we received another violation: military-style footwear left on the porch. That time, it was Tessa's running shoes. Black New Balance. Regulation issue. But the most absurd came a week later. A formal HOA complaint stating that resident behavior may be triggering to others due to intimidating attire. No names. No direct accusation. But it was obvious they were referring to Tessa wearing her uniform. That one made her laugh. But it didn't mean she let it go. Instead of responding directly to the HOA, Tessa began to compile everything. She created folders on her laptop, one for violation notices, another for video clips, one for HOA correspondence, and yet another titled simply, Witnesses. That's when she started talking to the neighbors. At first, it was casual. Conversations at the mailbox, a wave, and a hello during morning walks. But soon, the story started to surface. The Thompsons next door admitted Margaret had once threatened to fine them for letting their grandchildren draw with chalk on the sidewalk. Another neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, said she'd been accused of running an unauthorized garage operation because she liked to work on woodworking projects in her garage during the day. Tessa took notes. Then came the unexpected ally, Mark Livingston, a retired Air Force mechanic who lived 3 houses down. He approached Tessa one evening while she was out watering the plants. "Ma'am," he said, using the kind of respect only military folks truly understand, "I heard what happened with the cops. That wasn't right." Tessa nodded. "Thank you. I'm handling it." He looked around and leaned in slightly. "You're not the first one she's pulled that on." And then he told her. About 3 months before we moved in, another military couple had rented the house on the corner. The husband had deployed. The wife, who worked part-time at a local base, wore her uniform on duty days. Margaret had called the HOA multiple times, even allegedly reported them to the base command, claiming stolen valor. The couple moved out after only 6 months. That was when Tessa realized this wasn't just about her. It was a pattern. Margaret had a history of targeting military families. Maybe it was control, maybe jealousy, maybe something darker. But either way, it had to stop. So Tessa started collecting statements. Nothing formal, just casual video conversations. She'd speak to neighbors on camera, letting them share their stories. Not interviews, just testimonials. And one by one, the stories came in. Some were small. Margaret yelling at kids to turn down their bikes because their training wheels were too loud. Some were more serious. A woman named Priya said Margaret had filed noise complaints every time she hosted her elderly parents from out of state. It wasn't just military families. Margaret had a habit of going after anyone she didn't like or didn't understand. But the final straw? That came with the HOA meeting. Each month, the community center hosted a public HOA board meeting. They were typically boring affairs. Minutes read aloud, lawn care contract discussed, landscaping upgrades debated. But that month, Tessa showed up. She wore her uniform, not to provoke, not to flaunt, but to make a point. She was calm, respectful, but she wanted to be seen not just as someone being targeted, but as someone who had served her country and deserved dignity. I went with her. So did Mr. Livingston, and the Thompsons, and about a dozen other neighbors who quietly told Tessa, "We've got your back." Margaret sat at the center table, flanked by two board members, her cardigan buttoned all the way up, her mouth tight with the kind of nervous energy that only bullies get when they realize the crowd isn't with them anymore. When it came time for resident concerns, Tessa stood up. "Good evening," she began. "I'm Tessa Whitaker. I live on Wrenwood Lane. Some of you know me. Some of you have cited me. I'm here to respond to a series of formal and informal accusations that have been made against me, including the implication that I may be impersonating a member of the military." A ripple of whispers went through the room. Tessa continued. "So I brought my DD 214, my military ID, a copy of my awards, and a list of deployments. But I also brought something else." She placed a small USB drive on the table in front of the board. "This contains video footage from my home security system, body cam audio from a conversation with a responding police officer, and first-hand statements from nearly 15 of our neighbors about the ongoing pattern of harassment, racial targeting, and intimidation that's taken place in this neighborhood for over a year." The room fell silent. Even Margaret looked stunned. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Tessa didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence said everything. "I don't want revenge," she said. "I want accountability. I want a community that respects its veterans, not one that targets them for wearing a uniform. And I believe the rest of the people in this room want the same." A slow clap started from the back row, then another, and then applause. Real, supportive, heartfelt applause. That was the moment everything changed. Margaret didn't get up. She didn't speak. She simply sat there, staring straight ahead, as if someone had pulled the battery from her remote control. The clipboard stayed in her lap. The smugness drained from her face. But the consequences? Oh, they were only beginning. After that HOA meeting, you could feel the shift. The mood in the neighborhood wasn't just awkward. It was different. Like a heavy curtain had been lifted off the community, and now everyone could finally see what had been quietly festering behind hedges and freshly painted fences. Margaret, HOA Karen, had ruled over the block like a queen with a gavel for years. But now, her crown had started to slip. And my wife, Tessa, she didn't gloat. She didn't even smile when the applause broke out at the meeting. She simply gathered her notes, nodded to the board, and left the community center with dignity. But what most people in that room didn't realize was that she'd only played the opening move. What followed over the next few weeks wasn't loud or public or dramatic. Not at first. It was quiet, surgical, strategic, the kind of revenge that doesn't announce itself. It builds, layer by layer, one piece of pressure at a time. Tessa began by submitting a formal grievance to the HOA Oversight Committee at the city level. Most people didn't even know such a thing existed, but she'd done her research. The city maintained a committee for mediation between HOAs and residents, especially for cases involving pattern harassment or misuse of authority. She submitted a detailed complaint with timestamps, documents, and the full flash drive of video evidence. But she didn't stop there. She also filed a public records request with the HOA's legal office. Under state law, she was entitled to see HOA citations, incident logs, and internal correspondence that mentioned her name. What came back was worse than either of us imagined. There were 6 internal memos written by Margaret that referenced Tessa as a possible threat, and even one that accused her of using her military status to intimidate board members. There it was, in writing. The smear campaign wasn't just speculative, it was official, documented, traceable. We could have gone to a lawyer right then and there, but Tessa had another plan. She wanted to show that Margaret wasn't just wrong. She was unfit to lead. She didn't want to sue. She wanted Margaret to be held accountable by the very system she had abused. So Tessa compiled her findings into a document titled Pattern of Bias and Abuse of Power, a report on HOA misconduct. It was 37 pages long, complete with screenshots, timeline statements, and direct quotes. She printed copies and mailed them to every homeowner in the neighborhood. No anonymous posting. No fake signatures. Just a clean white envelope with our return address, a cover letter signed by Tessa, and a closing line that read, "If you've experienced similar behavior from HOA leadership, you're not alone, and you deserve better." Within 48 hours, our inbox was flooded. At least a dozen neighbors emailed or dropped off handwritten notes. One couple from 2 streets over said they'd been fined 3 separate times for their American flag being too bright under porch lights. Another resident admitted he had stopped attending meetings entirely after Margaret accused him of trespassing when he accidentally stepped onto the HOA lawn during a 4th of July picnic. The stories kept coming. So Tessa invited them over. One Sunday afternoon, our backyard became an unofficial support group. About 15 neighbors gathered with lawn chairs, notepads, lemonade, and one shared goal: reform the HOA, remove Margaret from leadership, and restore actual community. We called it the Restoration Committee. Sounds dramatic, but it was needed. They weren't just venting. They were organizing. They brought HOA bylaws, board member rosters, and even old meeting transcripts. Tessa, ever the mission planner, turned our dining room into a war room. On the wall, a whiteboard with 3 columns, violations, board actions, and target solutions. And at the top of the board, written in red marker, Phase 2, Board Election Strategy. Because that's what most people forget. HOA board members can be voted out. Tessa figured out when the next board elections were 2 months away, just enough time to build momentum. The Restoration Committee nominated 3 candidates: Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Livingston, and a soft-spoken retired teacher named Carl Simmons, who'd lived in the neighborhood for 20 years and had quietly hated Margaret's reign for 19 of them. Campaign flyers were printed. Door-to-door visits were organized. Stories were shared at community BBQs and online groups. What began as a quiet pushback became a full-on neighborhood movement. And Margaret? She started to feel it. She tried to fight back. Of course, she accused Tessa of organizing an anti-community faction. She sent emails to homeowners saying there was a militant group trying to take over the HOA. She even tried to issue new citations, one for unauthorized lawn signage and another for excessive foot traffic during backyard meetings. But by then, nobody cared. In fact, one of the biggest surprises came when a former board member, Thomas Grady, resigned midterm and left a note pinned to the HOA bulletin board that read, "I can no longer be part of a board that no longer serves its community. I support the Restoration Committee." It was over. Margaret just didn't know it yet. A few days later, Tessa received a formal letter from the City HOA Oversight Committee. They'd reviewed the complaint. They had found sufficient cause to open an investigation into Margaret's conduct, including possible bias, misuse of reporting systems, and falsified citations. The investigation would begin the following week, and Margaret would be required to present a formal defense before the city. I'll never forget the look on Tessa's face when she read that letter. It wasn't smugness. It was peace, like she'd finally brought the storm to shore. And if that wasn't enough, one night, around 8:30 p.m., as the sun dipped low and cicadas hummed across the lawn, Tessa and I heard a knock at the door. We opened it to find Margaret herself, standing there with a clipboard, shaking slightly, face pale. She looked at Tessa and said, "Can we speak privately?" Tessa didn't even flinch. She stepped out, arms crossed, back straight. Margaret took a breath. I didn't mean to cause harm. I take my position seriously. I have a responsibility. To harass veterans? Tessa, cut in. Margaret stammered. You could have come to me. We could have resolved this. Tessa looked at her like she was made of glass. I did come to you. You sent cops to my house. You accused me of impersonation. You tried to humiliate me for serving my country. Margaret looked down. Tessa added, Now it's your turn to answer for what you've done. Not to me, to everyone. Margaret left without another word. And that, my friend, was when we knew. The neighborhood had already decided. By the time the next HOA board election rolled around, the energy in the neighborhood felt completely different. You could almost smell it, this quiet buzz of defiance mixed with a growing sense of justice. People who had never shown up to community meetings before were now rallying behind folding tables with printed ballots. Lawns that once proudly bore HOA proud member signs were suddenly empty, silent. The Restoration Committee's campaign had worked. Tessa's story had struck a nerve with dozens of residents. Not just because she was right, but because she'd been targeted for something that should have been honored, not punished. And the best part? Tessa didn't run for the board. She didn't need the title or the power. She wanted the structure fixed, not to be the one holding the gavel. She stayed behind the scenes, organizing, connecting people, and building momentum. But on the day of the vote, when residents lined up outside the community center like it was a small-town election, she was there, calm, collected, wearing her navy pin on a plain blouse. The vote took less than 3 hours, and when the results were read aloud, all 3 Restoration Committee nominees, Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Livingston, and Carl Simmons, won by a landslide. But that wasn't even the climax. The climax came 3 days later, during what would become the final HOA board meeting chaired by Margaret Dillinger. It was supposed to be a routine transition. New members would be sworn in, and the previous leadership would pass on their reports and records. But when Margaret entered the room, she was met with silence. Not angry silence. Not even dramatic. Just cold. Clinical. Her power had evaporated. And for someone like her, that was worse than being yelled at. She tried to smile. Tried to pretend it was business, as usual. But then Carl Simmons stood up, holding a large manila envelope, and calmly said, Before we begin, I have a statement from the City Oversight Board regarding the investigation into Mrs. Dillinger's conduct. You could hear the oxygen leave the room. Carl opened the letter, cleared his throat, and read, Based on evidence submitted by multiple residents and former board members, as well as audio and video documentation, the committee has found sufficient violations of procedural abuse, harassment, and misuse of community enforcement protocols under HOA Charter B-17. As such, the committee recommends the immediate removal of Mrs. Dillinger from any leadership role and a 24-month ban from future board involvement. Margaret's face turned sheet white. Someone in the second row gasped. Another quietly said, Good. Margaret stood, opened her mouth like she was about to object. But nothing came out. Instead, her hand trembled as she reached for her purse. She turned without a word and walked out of the room. The soft click of the door behind her was the last sound she made as HOA president. But karma, as they say, wasn't done. Because 2 days after that meeting, the city forwarded portions of the investigation to local law enforcement. Turns out, some of Margaret's violations weren't just unethical. They were illegal. Filing false police reports, misuse of HOA funds, retaliation against residents. That same week, a patrol car rolled up to her house, not to ours, and 2 officers knocked on her door. This time, she didn't answer like a queen on a throne. She came out slow, shaky, hands slightly raised as they handed her a court summons. Tessa and I watched from across the street. She didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She just whispered, That's what accountability looks like. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was finally starting to breathe again. Kids were back on the sidewalks with chalk. Porch lights stayed on past 10 p.m. Flags flew freely. And veterans, for the first time in a long time, were being thanked instead of fined. But perhaps the most poetic twist? About a week later, a folded note was left in our mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single card, a gold-edged thank you card. On it, someone had written, "Thank you for showing us that silence isn't the same as peace. You helped us find our voices." A neighbor. Tessa read it aloud, then placed it on our mantle like a medal, because in many ways it was... And just when we thought the story had run its course, one more unexpected chapter arrived. The local paper picked it up. One of the neighbors had anonymously tipped off a reporter, and within days, an article appeared in the Sunday section titled, "Veterans Fight for Justice Shakes Up Suburban HOA." It featured a photo of Tessa, taken during that pivotal HOA meeting, and a caption that read, "Navy veteran Tessa Whitaker stood alone until the neighborhood stood with her." The story went viral locally, and soon, other HOAs around the county started calling the City Oversight Board to review their own practices. Margaret's reign of quiet tyranny didn't just end. It became a case study in what happens when the wrong person is given too much power and the right person finally stands up. It's funny how neighborhoods change, not from the outside, but from the inside out. You don't really notice it until one morning you step outside and realize it's quieter, not because people have left, but because they finally exhaled. The neighborhood didn't go back to normal. It became better. Porch conversations became common. Neighbors started helping each other with yard work instead of submitting anonymous complaints. There was a new spirit of respect, especially toward veterans and military families. All the little signs of suppression, the tension, the fear of being watched, fined, or shamed, they were gone. Tessa, for her part, returned to her life with remarkable grace. She could have run for HOA president herself. She could have demanded accolades or awards. But instead, she went back to jogging in the mornings, planting her spring garden, and spending more time at the VA helping other women transition out of service. She never once bragged about what happened, because that's who she is. Quiet power, unshakable presence, the kind of strength that doesn't need attention to be felt. One afternoon, about a month after the final HOA meeting, we received a formal letter from the city, a commendation. It acknowledged Tessa's role in restoring lawful process, promoting ethical leadership, and representing the best of military and civilian integrity in residential governance. It came with a small plaque, which now sits in the corner of her bookshelf, tucked between a photo of her battalion and a little clay eagle our niece made her. But the real twist, the final irony, the one that wrapped this whole thing in a bow, it came in the form of a job posting. The new HOA board decided to hire a part-time community manager to handle paperwork, help mediate disputes, and coordinate events. A simple job. Civil, flexible hours. Paid with HOA funds. The posting went live on the community site, and within 2 days, they received 6 applications. One of them, Margaret Dillinger. Yes, really. She applied to work for the very board she used to rule. Whether it was desperation or denial, no one knows. Maybe she thought her experience would outweigh her reputation. Maybe she just didn't know how to function without a clipboard in hand. When the board reviewed the applications, Carl Simmons, now president, simply read hers aloud, looked around the room, and said, "Well, that's bold." They declined her application unanimously, but the final blow came quietly. You see, part of the HOA's restructuring involved implementing a new community standard review process, basically a required reapproval of all HOA leadership members for ethics, conduct, and community standing. And Margaret, now a regular homeowner with no title and no allies, she failed the background review. Too many complaints. Too much documented abuse of power. And most damning of all, video evidence tied to the false police report she filed on Tessa, which was still under city review. The result? Margaret was officially banned from serving on any HOA-related committee or subcommittee for 5 years. She lost all authority, all committee voting privileges, and could no longer issue or submit neighborhood citations. She wasn't just out of power. She was excommunicated from the very system she weaponized. From fear to forgotten. From queen of the block to just another name on the newsletter distribution list. But it didn't stop there. Months later, the HOA hosted its first Memorial Day barbecue since the scandal. This time, it was bigger, more inclusive, and built on real community spirit. They chose a park near the entrance of the subdivision, a green space Margaret once tried to fence off because kids made it too loud. The new board had it landscaped, cleaned, and renamed. And guess what they called it? Whitaker Commons. The park was dedicated to Tessa, not just for her military service, but for courage, citizenship, and community leadership in the face of unjust adversity. The sign is made of simple engraved wood, next to a stone bench and a small bronze plaque. And on the day they unveiled it, Tessa said just one thing into the microphone. "I didn't fight for recognition. I fought so no one else would have to." The crowd applauded. Some cheered. Even a few tears were shed. And in that moment, the last trace of Margaret's shadow seemed to evaporate. As for Margaret herself, rumor has it she tried to move, put her house up for sale. But the listing sat stagnant for months. Word had spread, locally, even to nearby communities. The woman who tried to find veterans for planting flags, who had called the police on a Navy veteran in uniform, who had turned a peaceful neighborhood into a battleground of fear, was now a cautionary tale. A few residents said they saw her outside less and less. Eventually, she took down her security cameras. Her flower beds went untrimmed. The clipboard never returned. We never spoke again. And honestly, that was fine. Sometimes the best revenge is letting people live with what they did, and knowing the world finally saw them for what they truly are. As for us, we stayed. And the neighborhood, this once sterile, rule-obsessed place, became a true community. Veterans felt welcome. Families started to know each other's names. And for the first time in a long time, there was laughter on the sidewalks again. And every time Tessa jogs past a little park with her name carved into the sign, she nods. Not with pride, not with ego, but with quiet recognition. Because in the end, she didn't just stand up to a Karen. She stood up for everyone.